In this week's call, we want to discuss Alzheimer's disease, and we've spoken about Alzheimer's on many videos in the past, so I would direct you back to the channel to view the ones you haven't seen. But I'm excited about this week's because we're going to continue, our journey towards figuring out what we can do practically and naturally to help prevent Alzheimer's and slow its progression. And in this segment, we're going to look at two cutting edge research papers that were published in the last 2 months. We sit here today on February 3rd, 2025, and these two papers were published in December 2024 and January 2025. So you couldn't hardly get any fresher scientific research on the topic. And so we'll dive into that today. And both papers provide us information on the disease, but then also information that we can infer practical strategies from moving forward today. So while they continue to, tease out the details via clinical trials and everything, we can start implementing it clinically in practice and observe for improvement in our patients, in their function, and in ourselves. So let's jump over to the research. Here we are with the research papers, and the first one is entitled Microglia Degrade Alzheimer's Amyloid-beta Deposits Extracellularly via Digestive Hexophagy. So yeah, mouthful, but it'll make more sense here in a moment. And then the second paper, so this is the December paper, the January 2025 paper in Brain Research is entitled Tau amyloid iron oligodendrocytes ferroptosis and inflammaging in hippocampal formation of age rats submitted to aerobic exercise. So again, the titles are a mouthful, but there is practical information in both, I promise. Let's actually start with this brain research paper first because I believe it has the better background information on Alzheimer's. So we will look at that first. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive neurodegenerative disease affecting memory, language, and thinking with no curative treatment. So that's the first place we want to stop because, if we look at Alzheimer's as a progressive neurodegenerative disease, then you're limited in the care you're going to get from the mainstream model that looks at it that way, because if it's seen as progressively neurodegenerative, then there's really no open-mindedness by the conventional model to the possibility of reversing the underlying mechanisms. I talk about this in chapter 1 of my book, The Autoimmune Answer, in relation to Parkinson's disease, because Parkinson's is also, from a mainstream perspective, considered a progressive neurodegenerative disease. And again, I talk about in there and cite research to show that if your lens at which you look at the disease through is that it's progressively neurodegenerative and there's no cure, then how much success are you going to get in improving the disease once you're diagnosed? Not a whole lot. So if we're trying to prevent a disease or slow a disease or reverse a disease, we first have to have an open mind that that's even possible. Otherwise, we're not going to get very far. And this is part of the problem with the research on Alzheimer's as it's been up to this point, is that most research isn't even asking the question, is it reversible or preventable? It's like, hey, what drug can we do to slow it? And so again, from a functional medicine perspective, we're open-minded and we realize everything's connected to everything. And as this paper will even say down here, there are symptoms of Alzheimer's, or the process is going on 20 years before the diagnosis occurs. And so let me find that here. Let's just start at the top. We'll get there. All right. So sentence 2, symptoms appear gradually and pathological, there it is. That's the sentence I was looking for. Sentence 2, symptoms appear gradually and pathological brain changes may occur 20 years before the physical and psychological signs, pointing to the urgent development of preventive interventions. So these guys in brain research are different from the typical researchers or the mainstream medical model, because they're saying, hey, we recognize changes can occur 20 years before the diagnosis. So let's figure out how to prevent this, because if we can prevent those changes, 20 years ago, then we prevent the diagnosis 20 years later. And again, the similar thing has been found in Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease, if you know anyone with it, you recognize it as a shuffling gait, a flexion dominance, a masked face, slurring, and maybe drooling, and just a generalized slowing down of everything. But in Parkinson's disease, it's known that the harbingers of Parkinson's disease that occur 10 years before the diagnosis or even longer is a loss of smell and or constipation. So, if we have a middle-aged to elderly person developing a loss of smell or constipation that they hadn't had, previously in their life, perhaps, and they have a family history of neurodegenerative disease, perhaps that is the early signs for what will become Parkinson's if they don't do anything. Well, the same idea with Alzheimer's. There are pathological brain changes up to 20 years before the physical signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's. The main biological features of Alzheimer's are amyloid protein plaques, tau tangles, which amyloid protein plaques and tau tangles are just, you could think of just knots being formed in the neurons in your brain, or they're protein aggregates, so they're just clumps of inefficient tissue that it doesn't work anymore. So we want to prevent the buildup of those proteins. Myelin degeneration is another biological feature, and iron deposits in the brain. So those are the features that you can look for on MRI and other types of testing. And the sentence before that, which I didn't highlight, but we will see, is that physical activity has been investigated as a preventative tool to defeat those biological features of Alzheimer's. Our results indicate that iron overload in the oligodendrocytes, which is a form of neuron, is an inducer of ferroptosis. What the heck is that? Ferroptosis is cell death caused by iron-induced inflammation, basically. So if you have iron overload, especially in the oligodendrocytes of the brain, that drives neuron cell death via ferroptosis or iron-induced inflammation and inflammaging, and promotes the plaquing and the myelin degeneration and iron deposits that promote Alzheimer's. Physical exercise reduces inflammaging and improves the axon-myelin volume relations, or neuron health, basically. More than 6 million Americans live with Alzheimer's disease, and by 2050, the estimate is 12.7 million will have it. Pathological amyloid protein plaques and tau tangles deposit in the brain are accepted as the main biological features. However, individuals with no signals of clinical Alzheimer's can present with both brain deposits, both beta amyloid and tau tangles. So, what do we do with that? Well, recently, myelin sheath degeneration appeared as a new hypothesis and target in the etiology of Alzheimer's. A decrease in myelination and oligodendrocyte function occurs before the pathological accumulation of amyloid and tau. So now they're realizing, hey, here are the steps that occur before those protein clumps are obvious to us. And so again, maybe we can see these things sooner and earlier so that the patient doesn't progress. The oligodendrocytes are the highest iron-containing cells, and the degeneration of their cytoplasmic membrane, or the myelin sheath, may release iron, promoting beta amyloid pathology, or the clumping. Dysfunction in the cholinergic system may also occur in preclinical, early, and late stages. The cholinergic system is, choline, or the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, is what the part of the brain that degenerates in Alzheimer's is primarily relies upon. So that part of the brain is called the hippocampus, and this study is looking at how Alzheimer's impacts the hippocampus and how exercise impacts the hippocampus and those associated changes. So dysfunction in the cholinergic system may also occur early on in Alzheimer's patients. Our hypothesis describes Alzheimer's etiology or cause as a process triggered by beta amyloid peptide accumulation with the ineffective clearance of the clumps in the brain. So we all make beta amyloid, okay, which is one of those proteins that aggregate in the brain of Alzheimer's patients, but we all don't develop Alzheimer's. So what's the difference there? Or why do some people develop it and some don't? Well, the key is the ineffective clearance, right? If we have effective clearance, then the fact that I made some amyloid beta in my brain today is no big deal because I effectively cleared it. It's not accumulating, damaging my brain. I'm good to go. So if we can figure out, well, how do we promote effective clearance of beta amyloid and tau tangles and the like, then that would suggest we could probably effectively prevent clumping or accumulation in the brain and the disease process. So again, looking for cause instead of waiting for the clumps are there and trying to, drug symptoms, waiting for cause is much, or looking for cause and addressing is much better. Well, we know things that can help us reduce clumping in the brain. One of them is sleep. So again, sleep is super important for our health in so many ways, relevant to short-term memory and Alzheimer's and dementia risk. Sleep is huge because recently, in the last few years, researchers found what's called the glymphatic system. And the glymphatic system is a lymphatic system in the brain, or basically a bunch of water channels that wash the brain or bathe the brain every night when we sleep. If you aren't sleeping well, if you don't have the proper quality, quantity, and timing of sleep, then your brain doesn't take its nightly bath as efficiently, and you aren't washing the brain and washing away those clumps of beta amyloid and tau tangles and other neuroinflammatory substrates in the brain. So sleep is crucial, and one reason for that is sleep is when the lymphatic system gives you your brain bath. Okay, so if you're not sleeping well and you have a family history of dementia, getting to sleep and getting quality sleep is going to be very important for you. Another thing that promotes effective clearance is going to be physical activity and exercise, as we'll see further down in this study. And one other thing is microglia, or our microglia, which are the immune cells in the brain. And that's what the second paper is about. This paper shows us that healthy microglia degrade or break down the Alzheimer's beta amyloid deposits. And so we want to have a healthy brain immunity so that we can have healthy memory and healthy brain function and prevent dementia. So what are microglia? Well, microglia are the immune cells in the brain. They're these orange guys here in these pictures. And this green kind of ball of yarn here you see is the beta amyloid. This is the protein plaque that builds up in the brain of Alzheimer's patients and creates the damage and interference that can promote dementia. This December paper, these researchers found that, hey, well, what they've known in the past is that if a beta amyloid plaque is small enough, one of these microglia could just phagocytose it or basically eat it. Their mouth can open wide enough like a Pac-Man and just eat that clump. But this clump in the picture is larger than any of these individual microglia, right? So if the only way we can defeat these is the Pac-Man way or the phagocytosis or to eat it, then when the clumps are this big, we're in trouble. What these researchers discovered and showed is that there's a second way that we can break these down, and that's called digestive exophagy, where essentially, if we zoom in right here to this, what's called a lysosomal synapse, where the microglia is meeting the amyloid plaque, we can see it right here. Here's the amyloid plaque, and here's the microglia where it's touching it. So what can happen is the microglia has these lysosomes with acid in it, and it releases the acids, and they go out and digest the beta amyloid plaque extracellularly, so outside the microglia. The Pac-Man way is it eats it and takes it inside to the cell and it digests it inside the microglia. This way, the microglia, you could picture it as just throwing up, blah, blah, just dumping vomit, acidic vomit on these beta amyloid plaques, and as well as acidic hydrogen ions, and that will break down these plaques extracellularly. So this is groundbreaking because if we can promote healthy microglia or maintain healthy microglia as we age, then we can maintain healthy brain, healthy beta amyloid surveillance and breakdown, and again, slow or prevent the development of those plaques that drive Alzheimer's disease. So that's big time. So again, driving effective clearance, exercise, sleep, healthy microglia. Well, how do you drive healthy microglia? Well, you want to prevent head injury. You want to prevent neuroinflammation. You want to promote healthy immune function and not promote autoimmunity. Okay. Now, many people on this call have probably heard of the ApoE gene because the ApoE gene is associated with risk for Alzheimer's. And you can see here the presence of one out of, you have two possible genes. You get one from mom, one from dad. So if one of your parents gave you an ApoE4 allele, that increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's up to 3 times. But you can see here, only 1% of Alzheimer's patients have a deterministic gene mutation for Alzheimer's. So in other words, 99% of Alzheimer's patients, it wasn't genetic only. Okay. The deterministic gene mutation is, hey, that was responsible for Alzheimer's. The other 99% of patients, that's not the explanation. So again, the good thing about that is for these 1%, well, we can't change their genes, so that's going to be really hard. But the other 99% of people, it's something outside the gene, above the gene, or epigenetic, environmental, choice, lifestyle, right? Lots of room there for us to win and make changes by making better decisions. One thing we can do is not have too much iron. So iron accumulates in the brain, and it's a normal consequence of aging, and it rapidly increases after age 60. So we can test iron levels, not directly in the brain, but we can test your systemic iron levels and know, hey, if your systemic iron is high, then perhaps your brain iron is high too. And we want to lower your systemic levels of iron to hopefully impact your brain levels. Disrupting iron balance in the brain can result in pathological accumulation and increased oxidative stress or rust. Interactions between brain iron pathological accumulation and cognition were observed in humans. So if you get too much iron in the brain, cognitive defects were noticed. In clinically diagnosed Alzheimer's patients, iron accumulates mainly in the proteinopathies affected areas such as the hippocampus. So again, if you in patients with Alzheimer's, the iron prefers or appears to build up mostly in the hippocampus, which is the short-term memory section of the brain, which is what degenerates. Most of the brain iron is stored in oligodendrocytes and may be associated with myelin synthesis. If we have dysfunction in iron or iron overload, we generate too much rust, leading to death of oligodendrocytes, called ferroptosis. Again, iron-mediated cell death. Ferroptosis is vital for the development of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and vascular dementia. Iron and ferritin can also be detected in microglia cytoplasm. Where do we hear about microglia? This paper, right? So one way that the microglia become dysfunctional is iron overload as well. So now we lose their ability to eat these properly and vomit on them properly. So we don't want too much iron in the brain. In the past 20 years, research has been conducted to clarify how physical activity affects neuron function or brain function. Animal studies demonstrate a relationship between physical exercise and cognitive improvement, besides a higher survival of hippocampus neurons. Also, an increase in neurogenesis or production of new neurons, an increase in dendritic branching, so the connections between neurons. And when those connections are formed, that's how we make memories and learn new things, make new pathways. Exercise led to reduction in the formation of neurofibrillary tangles. Alzheimer's beta amyloid aggregates, rust, and inflammation. So again, there's lots of research showing that physical exercise, in this case aerobic exercise, is beneficial to brain, which isn't rocket science to us, but specifically for the mechanisms that could lead to Alzheimer's disease. So we want to be exercising, we want to be watching our iron levels and not taking in too much iron if our iron levels are high, and lowering them if they are high. So iron foods, the most bioavailable sources of iron in the diet is red meat. Another environmental way that we take in iron in the diet is cooking on iron skillets. So if you're someone with high iron, you probably do not want to cook on iron skillets. And as we've talked about in previous videos, you don't want to cook on aluminum either. So stainless steel or ceramic might be your options there. And then we want to promote healthy microglial function, as we saw in this paper. So to sum it up, what has this new research added to our body of knowledge for Alzheimer's? Well, they discovered a new pathway by which healthy microglia can help us break down beta amyloid plaques, especially ones that are too large for them to eat via the Pac-Man mechanism that we used to know and think was the main and only way. So that's huge, because now we have another angle by which we can degrade these things. And we also learned from these papers the importance of managing iron levels, managing inflammation, microglial health, exercising properly, and sleeping, right? The lymphatic system, taking your brain bath each night is going to be very important for your cognitive health, both in the short and long term, as well as, all the other things we've talked about in previous videos that are impacted by proper sleep. So let's open this up for questions. While we wait for questions, I will remind you that these papers are brand new, and more recently, it's about a year old probably, is that there are tests available now commercially through LabCorp to look at your levels of amyloid beta and tau tangles in the blood. And so this is groundbreaking when this was released, because these are validated biomarkers in the blood to look at the buildup of these proteins that drive this disease process. So you don't necessarily have to wait for it to show up on MRI. We can get a look at the blood and see, where are you at potentially in the process. Any questions or comments?
When you're talking about this, is it mostly preventive, or if somebody's diagnosed, can they go backward a little? Can they reverse some of it when they implement the changes?
The suspicion is yes. I don't have hard data myself for you, but there are lots of clinicians doing work that are showing that they are. So Dr. Dale Bredesen would be one through the Bredesen protocol. He's doing, basically a functional medicine or a lifestyle approach, multifactorial approach with Alzheimer's patients, and seeing great changes. And he's got books out and tons of content. So he would be one to look at. And then one way you can show improvement in these areas is there's a validated questionnaire called the MMSE, or Mini Mental Status Exam. And basically you'd have a person that you're suggesting cognitive impairment, and they fill out this questionnaire, and it asks them to do things like say the months in order, or every other month, or look at a face of a clock and draw it, or remember 3 words, and then 5 minutes later you come back and ask them those words, and did they remember them? So it's basically what its name implies, a mini mental status exam. And depending on the score on that questionnaire, you're scored as, say, normal, mild cognitive impairment, or extreme, and hey, you better go get examined further for Alzheimer's. And so by implementing these lifestyle things, I've seen personally in my clinic too, the MMSEs improve. And so that would suggest the person's short-term memory and cognitive function is improving. Has that shrunk a beta amyloid plaque on an MRI? I can't say that. But really, the more important thing is, has their memory and cognitive function improved, right? From
Right.
a, the patient wants to function better. The patient's family wants them to be more of what they were, right? So, um, yes.
That's great news. Thank you. I appreciate that.
See, we had a question in the chat I saw. Would these studies apply to Lewy body dementia? So Lewy body dementia is a different form, but um, so there's going to be some specifics to each of these, but in general, yes. I mean, you still need the lymphatic system, you need the brain bath, you do need the circulation and oxygenation, and microglia health for whether it's Lewy body, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, vascular. The brain's the brain, right? So in general, we need all these things apply, and that's what's great is, and why it'll never be shouted from the mountaintops because they can't patent it. But practicing these lifestyle strategies is going to promote healthy brain regardless of the label you've been given. Right. So again, there will be nuance individually, but in general, these are the things we can do when we're not diagnosed and hopefully never get diagnosed. But then also, if we happen to get diagnosed, these things are still needed and necessary and likely beneficial no matter where we are on the spectrum.